They stood frozen in the morning dust, hands limp at their sides, boots caked with mud. Behind them, the barbed wire of the Texas camp still shimmered in the rising heat. Before them, an American sergeant in a wide-brimmed cowboy hat leaned casually on a fence post and tipped his head toward a white wooden chapel. "Church starts at 10, he said. Then he walked away. No orders, no threats, just that. The German prisoners, most barely out of their 20s, stared at one another, confused. Was this a trick, a punishment cloaked in kindness? They had heard rumors that Americans were strange, soft, obsessed with freedom and religion. But this was something else. The guards opened the gate. No guns raised, just a quiet invitation. One man stepped forward, then another. By the time the chapel bell rang, 24 German POWs had filed in, sat on pine benches, and stared at stained glass in silence. No sermon could have shaken them more than that moment already had. The heat pressed down on them like a hand. Texas didn't feel like any place they'd imagined. Not hell, not heaven, just an open, endless stretch of dry land, stitched with fences and humming with cicadas. When their transport trucks had pulled into the compound 2 weeks earlier, the German prisoners expected spit and curses. Instead, the guards leaned against the gates like they had nowhere to be. One scratched his chin, glanced up, and said plainly, "Welcome to Camp Hearn." That was it. No boots slammed against the ground. No raised voices, just the sun, the dust, and the unnerving calm of men who didn't need to prove anything. The prisoners climbed down slowly, blinking into the glare. Their boots touched American soil for the first time, and nothing happened. No guns jabbed their backs. No one even shouted. The barbed wire that enclosed the camp was neat and uniform, stretched precisely between wooden posts. Even the watchtowers looked indifferent, like they had been built more out of habit than fear. One POW from Dresden muttered, "This can't be right," and kept his hand close to his side, half expecting to be hit for speaking. Inside the camp, the barracks were plain but solid. Wooden planks, tin roofs, canvas cots. Water from the taps ran clean. Soap came in hard, white bricks that smelled like lye. Food arrived 3 times a day, warm and portioned. Bread without sawdust, meat without gristle. Coffee that was bitter but real. A young man named Oscar, who had fought near Normandy and lost 2 fingers to shrapnel, sat at a long mess hall table and stared at his tray like it might disappear. He hadn't seen butter since Stalingrad. When a guard passed and nodded at him, he couldn't help it. He flinched. The guard didn't even notice, just kept walking, whistling something that sounded like a country tune. The rhythms of camp life unfolded with unsettling smoothness. Reveille at sunrise, work assignments divided into shifts, tending vegetables, fixing fences, washing laundry. No beatings, no dogs, no punishments that weren't listed clearly on the board by the admin hut. One man asked if this was a trick. Another whispered that Americans liked to soften you first, before something worse came. But the days kept passing, and nothing happened. Or maybe something was happening, just not the way they were trained to see. They had been told capture was a fate worse than death, that the Americans would mock them, humiliate them, grind them into dust. But when Private Heinrich spilled a bucket of potatoes in front of a sergeant, the American just bent down, helped him scoop them up, and said, "Next time, carry it closer to your chest." No malice, no mockery, just advice. It left Heinrich shaken. That night he didn't speak. He just sat on his bunk, staring at the knot in the wooden beam above his head, trying to understand what it meant to be helped by a man you were raised to hate. Then came the Sunday morning. A cowboy hat, a lean man leaning against the post like a preacher out of an old folk tale. The prisoners were gathering near the yard, expecting a count or inspection, when the man simply pointed toward the chapel and said, "Church starts at 10. Then he tipped his hat and walked off like it was the most normal thing in the world. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. No orders followed, no threats, just that sentence, still echoing in the air. It broke something, not loudly, but like a fault line deep underground, the kind of break you only feel in your chest. They had been waiting for chains and were offered a pew instead. That morning, under a wide blue sky that smelled of dust and cedar, something shifted. Not faith, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in a wall they didn't know they had built. Because when one man stepped forward and walked toward the chapel, it wasn't obedience, it was curiosity, and that, in captivity, is its own kind of rebellion. He had grown up in a farmhouse outside Lubeck, where the fields rolled into the forest like green waves. His mother made potato dumplings every Sunday. His father smelled of hay and diesel and never missed a church service unless the tractor broke down. That same boy, now a soldier in a sweat-soaked shirt, had once knelt beneath anti-aircraft guns and tracked American bombers in the sky, believing each silhouette was a monster. That was how they were taught. The Americans were beasts, bred from greed and filth, incapable of honor. The Reich had been meticulous in its lessons, cartoons on classroom walls, posters warning of mongrel blood, radio hosts calling for annihilation. Every story, every headline, carved a truth into their bones. Capture was shame, and the Americans would strip you of your humanity. The last days of the war shattered those beliefs in ways no propaganda could prepare them for. In Hamburg, the sky turned orange at midnight. Firebombs fell like iron hail, flattening blocks in minutes. One prisoner, Matthias, remembered carrying his younger brother's body down 3 flights of burning stairs. Another man from Dresden had survived by crawling into a sewage tunnel with 10 strangers. Only 3 came out. They watched their cities become ash, their flags torn down, their commanders vanish into smoke or cyanide, and yet they still clung to one certainty. If the Americans caught them, it would be a slow unraveling of dignity. But the unraveling did not come. What came instead was bacon. The moment of capture still played in slow motion behind their eyes, the truck doors opening, the boots hitting the dirt. The guards yelling in English, not rage, just instructions. Hands up, walk straight, no sudden moves. Then the smell hit them. Bacon, coffee, a kitchen fire curling smoke toward the trees. One man fell to his knees, not from a blow, but because his legs simply gave out. They were herded, not beaten, counted, not cursed. Inside the camp, they were handed towels. Actual towels, a bar of soap that didn't crumble in the hand. When they stripped for delousing, they waited for cameras, for mockery. But the guards looked away politely, as if dignity mattered here. It was not kindness they felt first. It was confusion, a confusion so deep it burned. Each small act, a guard offering water, a doctor checking a bandage, chipped away at the stories they had been told. They were still enemies, weren't they? Still prisoners? Then why the blankets? Why the medicine? Why the second helping of stew? Hunger made it hard to resist, but the deeper wound came from how easy it was to accept. Every bite became a betrayal, every comfort, a quiet fracture. They remembered their mothers back home boiling nettles for soup, children queuing in bombed-out cellars for bread that never came. One prisoner folded his bacon into a napkin and hid it in his pocket, too ashamed to enjoy it. Another wrote a letter he never sent. "We are fed here, and no one calls us filth." They had expected to be broken by violence, but they were being undone by mercy. It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. Because that Sunday morning, when the cowboy in the hat pointed to the chapel and said, "Church starts at 10," it was not just an invitation, it was a contradiction sharpened to a blade. For men raised to believe the enemy would humiliate them, nothing was more dangerous than being treated as men, and that danger had already begun to bloom inside them. The chapel stood just outside the main compound, its whitewashed walls flaking beneath the sun, roof sloped like the brim of a hat. It was smaller than they expected, modest. A single bell hung in a wooden tower, swaying gently in the breeze. The windows, though simple, wore stained glass in faded blues and reds, not ornate, not grand, just enough to catch the light and scatter it across the wooden floor in soft kaleidoscopic pools. The door creaked as the prisoners entered, one by one, not led, not pushed. No guards flanked the doorway, no chains rattled. Just that voice in memory. Church starts at 10. Inside, pine benches lined both sides of a narrow aisle. No decorations adorned the walls, only a rough wooden cross above the pulpit. The scent was a mix of old wood and candle smoke, not holy, not ominous, but oddly familiar, like a memory of childhood, half forgotten. Lucas, a former medic from Bremen, walked to the second row and sat, hands resting on his knees. He hadn't entered a church since the summer of '39, the last time his whole family had gone together, before uniforms replaced Sundays and prayers were replaced with orders. He didn't know why he had come now, only that he couldn't not come. The men filled the rows in silence. Boots scuffed against the floor. One or two removed their caps, not from habit, but from instinct, or maybe shame. No one spoke. Then the door closed, and the preacher stepped into view. He was older than they expected, gray hair tucked behind his ears, his voice soft as a breeze through cotton fields. He didn't raise his voice, didn't speak of war or nation. He didn't even mention Germany. What he offered instead was something deeper and stranger, the idea that a man could be seen, truly seen, even if he had worn the wrong uniform. He read from his Bible in English, slowly, not expecting them to understand. But somehow they did. It wasn't the words, it was the tone, the rhythm, the pauses between thoughts. His voice was steady, but it carried weight. Not the weight of command, but of stillness, of sorrow, of forgiveness offered without asking who deserved it. He looked out at them as if he knew who they were and still wanted them there. That, more than anything, made them shift in their seats. Some stared at the floor, hands clasped tight. Others dared to look up, watching how the colored light painted their hands red and blue. Lucas closed his eyes and tried to remember a prayer. Nothing came. Only a memory, his brother, dead in a field hospital outside Kursk, whispering a name that never reached its end. The preacher paused, raised his hand, and let the silence stretch. No one interrupted. For a moment, even the birds outside seemed to quiet. When it ended, there was no call to the altar, no shouts of salvation. Just the same calm voice that had begun it, now saying, "Peace be with you," and stepping down. The men didn't move at first, as if standing would break something. Then, slowly, one rose, then another. Lucas lingered. His knees felt heavy, not from pain, but from something older, something deeper. He turned to the window. Dust still danced in the stained light like ash from a fire long extinguished. Outside, the guards waited, but they weren't watching. One leaned against the fence, arms crossed, face unreadable. The prisoners filed out in silence. No one spoke of the sermon, no one needed to. A seed had been planted, not belief, not yet. But perhaps the question, If a man who lost nothing could still offer grace, what did that mean for those who had lost everything? And more quietly still, had they been seen? Really seen? Not as soldiers, not as Nazis, just men. The pencils came in small bundles, passed out at the end of the week alongside folded sheets of coarse paper. They were offered without ceremony. No promises that the letters would be sent, no assurances that they would be read by the people they loved. Only the invitation, simple, quiet, to write. A few men tucked the materials into their pockets without looking. Others stared at the blank page like it might swallow them. Lucas sat on his bunk, the paper resting on his knee, pencil in hand, unmoving for nearly an hour. The first line was always the hardest. Some men started with, "I am alive," but the truth felt heavier than that. Others tried, "We are treated well," and scratched it out. A few wrote nothing at all, just folded the page and left it blank, as if their silence might still carry meaning. But then a letter passed through the barracks, not official, not copied, just whispered about. "I sat in a church in Texas," it read, "and no one called me a Nazi. They called me neighbor." The words hit like a stone dropped in still water. Some men scoffed, said it was naive, said it was dangerous, but others, quietly, felt a strange ache in their chest, the kind of ache that comes not from pain, but from remembering something that once mattered. Lucas began his letter differently. "Muti, I don't know how to explain where I am." For many, writing became a form of confession. Not about guilt, not yet, but about bewilderment. "They feed us more than I ate all last winter," one wrote. "We attend services on Sundays. There is music, there is silence. I do not understand it." Another wrote only 3 lines. "The preacher spoke of mercy. I could not look him in the eye. I do not think I believe him, but I wanted to." And yet beneath every word was a shadow, the fear that these letters, if they arrived, would not bring comfort, but condemnation. What would their mothers think, knowing their sons slept under clean sheets and ate warm bread while back home the streets were lined with rubble and ash? One man folded his letter into quarters, then smaller still, and burned it behind the barracks. "It is too kind," he muttered. "They won't believe me. They'll think I've gone soft." For every line of thanks, there was a line of guilt. Lucas remembered his mother's kitchen, the scent of rye bread steaming on the windowsill. He could still hear the sound of the wooden radio in the corner, broadcasting news of the Führer's speeches. They used to pray before meals. She would hum a hymn, one he hadn't thought of in years, until he heard a woman sing it quietly during chapel. Not in German, but close enough. He wrote, "I heard her voice and thought of you. I nearly wept, but I didn't. I was afraid someone would see." Others remembered different things, the clink of spoons in chipped bowls, the way their fathers lit a pipe after supper, the sound of boots on linoleum floors during inspections. They had been taught that survival was stoic, silent. That to feel was to weaken. But now, in this place of strange peace, memory stirred against that silence like wind through old grass. The letters piled in a small wooden box near the front office. No one knew if they would reach Berlin or Leipzig or the broken shell of Nuremberg. But the act of writing, of reaching across the wire with trembling hands, became a ritual, a surrender of a different kind, not to the Americans, but to the truth that they no longer knew who they were, only who they had been told to be. And with every pencil scratch, something unspoken found its way to the page. Not absolution, not yet, but longing for home, for warmth, for forgiveness that might never come. The Bible appeared on a Thursday. No one saw who left it, but by the time the evening sun stretched long across the chapel floor, it was there, a thick, leather-bound volume resting alone on the front bench. Worn at the edges, its spine cracked, the cover embossed not in English, but in German. Someone whispered that the chaplain had left it there, quietly, without saying a word. A few men noticed. Most didn't care. Others watched it like it might bite. No one touched it. For 3 days the Bible sat untouched. Dust began to settle on the cover. A few prisoners looked at it and quickly looked away, as if staring too long might pull something loose inside them. For Lucas, it became a fixture. Not quite an object, not quite a presence. He walked past it each time he swept the chapel floor, his boots soft on the wooden boards. It reminded him of his mother's Bible, the one she had kept under her bed, pages dog-eared and stained with years. She used to press flowers between the pages of Psalms. Lucas had not prayed in years, not since the telegram arrived about his brother, Hans, killed outside Kharkov, shot through the spine. They had grown up only a year apart, inseparable. Hans had carried a wooden cross in his breast pocket. After his death, Lucas threw his own away. He never spoke of it again. That night, when the others were playing cards or writing letters by the barracks lamps, Lucas walked back to the chapel. He didn't plan to. His feet simply carried him. The air was cooler inside. He sat in the second row. The Bible waited. He stared at it for a long time before reaching out. The cover felt warm, as if someone had only just set it down. When he opened it, the spine groaned like an old house. The first page was blank. The second held a name, someone's grandfather, perhaps, and a faded address in Silesia. Lucas turned to the Gospel of Matthew and began to read aloud. His voice cracked. He wasn't reading for meaning, not yet, just for the rhythm, the sound, the familiarity. Behind him, the door creaked open. A pair of boots stepped in, then another. 3 men, silent, not joining him, but not leaving either. They stood in the back, arms folded, listening like they were eavesdropping on something they didn't want to admit they missed. The words in that Bible weren't just verses. They were memories of kitchens warmed by bread, of wooden pews beneath cold church steeples, of candle-lit vigils during long Decembers. But now those same verses felt altered, changed. Each word carried the weight of everything that had come after. The uniforms, the slogans, the graves. To Lucas, the Bible was not comfort. It was confrontation, a challenge. Could a man still believe in mercy after watching a village burn? Could he believe in peace when his own hands had held a rifle? He kept coming back, night after night. Not to pray, but to think, to sit with questions that didn't fit on paper. Others followed, some curious, some bitter, some just needing silence. No one spoke, no one preached. But the chapel began to feel different. Less like a place of answers, more like a place where it was safe to ask. And so the Bible stayed. Not a symbol of faith regained, but of faith questioned. The words were the same, but the men reading them were not, and maybe that was the beginning of something, not belief. But awareness that even in a war of nations the fiercest battles were fought in silence between a man and the stories he'd stopped telling himself. It started with a note, faint, unsure, and completely out of place. The chapel had always been a sanctuary of stillness. But one afternoon, as the men raked gravel along the camp path, they heard it through the open windows. A piano, hesitant and imperfect. The sound stopped them mid-step. It was not a march, not a radio broadcast, not some victory tune. It was a hymn, and they knew it. The guards had hauled in the piano earlier that morning, its legs scuffed and its ivory keys yellowed from time. An American soldier, young, clean-shaven, and with the slouched confidence of someone who had never seen war, sat down and began to play without fanfare. The melody came slow at first, then steadier. "Bleib bei mir, Herr," murmured one prisoner under his breath, recognizing the German version of the song. "Abide with me." They had sung it in churches before the war, before the uniforms, before the silence between God and man had grown too wide to cross. A few of the prisoners gathered at the open windows, unsure whether to stay. No one was being forced to listen. That was what made it unbearable. The hymn didn't accuse, it didn't demand, it just was, a sound from a world they thought they had left behind. Inside the chapel, the pianist kept going. He didn't look up, didn't play with drama, just let the music exist. One note after the other, like footsteps leading home. Lucas stood at the doorway, his hands in his pockets. He didn't sing, not yet, but his lips moved slightly, and his throat tightened. He remembered his mother's voice, soft and off-key, singing this very hymn while peeling potatoes. He remembered Hans tapping his foot beside her, trying not to laugh. That memory hit him like a fist. A few men began to hum, softly, uncertainly. The room filled with it, not volume, but presence. Like something long buried was stirring again, not with force, but with warmth. The melody folded over itself, familiar and foreign all at once. For a moment, there were no uniforms, no flags, just voices echoing from different mouths, saying the same thing. "It's the same God, isn't it?" one prisoner whispered, barely loud enough to hear. No one answered, no one needed to. In that moment, the hymn was no longer a hymn. It was a bridge, fragile, invisible, and more dangerous than any rifle, because it reached past ideology, past guilt, straight into memory. For many of the men, it was the first time they had heard a sound from home that wasn't a scream or an order. It was unbearable in its gentleness. Then someone sang. He was a tall man from Leipzig, once a teacher, who hadn't spoken above a whisper since he arrived. His voice cracked on the first word. He stopped. Tried again. The note wavered, then held. Others joined in. No harmony, no coordination, just raw, exposed sound. Halfway through, the man stopped singing. He bent over, elbows on his knees, and began to weep. No one mocked him. No one spoke. The music drifted on, steady as breath, until the pianist let his hands rest on the keys. Silence settled again, but it felt different this time. Not hollow, but full. Later, some men would deny they sang at all. Others would say they didn't understand the words. But that wasn't true. They had understood everything. The song didn't belong to one side. It belonged to whoever had been a child once, whoever had prayed once, whoever had lost someone, and dared to remember them with more than silence. And in that moment, when the final note faded, they weren't prisoners. They were sons, brothers, men singing a song in another language and realizing it was theirs, too. After that, Lucas stopped writing letters. He told no one why. The paper still sat folded beneath his cot, the pencil worn to a nub. But each time he tried to begin again, his hand froze. What could he possibly write now? That he had wept during a hymn? That he had sung with the enemy? That for a moment he'd remembered the smell of his mother's coat and not the charred scent of cities fallen under fire? The words refused to come, so instead he turned to something else, something that asked no permission and required no response. Behind the chapel, on the back of a low bench no one sat on, he began to carve. Not names, not symbols, questions. Is dignity a sin? Can kindness be real if it comes from the other side? He carved slowly in the twilight hours after mess, using a spoon he'd filed down to a narrow point. He kept his back to the door, listening for boots, for voices, but no one came. Or maybe they did, and chose not to stop him. Lucas didn't think of it as rebellion, more like release. The chapel had become a kind of mirror, not a place of certainty, but reflection. In Germany, reflection had been dangerous. Doubt was treason. Here, it felt like survival. One evening, he added a new line. What if the war broke something we were never allowed to name? The next morning, when he came back to the bench, the spoon was gone. In its place was a small carving knife, clean, sharp, balanced. Beside it, a fresh piece of sanded wood. Lucas froze, looked around the chapel, but no one was there. The sunlight spilled through the stained glass, the same as always. Dust floated, indifferent. The chapel breathed its quiet, holy stillness. He picked up the knife. There was no note, no signature, but he knew what it meant. Someone had seen. A guard, maybe, one of the Americans, but instead of reporting it, instead of removing the carvings, they had offered more wood, a better tool, a gesture not of approval, but of permission, not to forget, but to think. That exchange, unspoken, unsanctioned, hit Lucas harder than any sermon, because in that moment he understood the truth that had been gnawing at the edges of every meal, every chapel visit, every song. The enemy wasn't playing a trick. They weren't softening them up for punishment. They weren't looking for apologies. They were simply treating them like men, and that, more than bullets, more than bombers, was undoing them. Because if the Americans were not monsters, if they could offer warmth without strings, space to question, even quiet recognition, then what did that make the world Lucas had come from? What did that make Germany? What did that make the officers who told them surrender was worse than death? He couldn't answer it. Not yet. Maybe never. But each new line he carved behind that chapel was an attempt, a slow, painful naming of truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Other prisoners began to read them. Some nodded, some turned away. One man, older, stood for nearly half an hour reading every line and whispered, "You're braver than I am," before walking off. The carvings became a confession, not to God, not to the Americans, but to each other. And somewhere in the quiet transaction between a prisoner and a guard, one giving questions, the other giving tools, something deeper passed between them. Not agreement, not forgiveness. Just the acknowledgement that even behind barbed wire there was still room to wonder who you were becoming. Even if you could never go back. By late spring, the chapel no longer felt like a place of worship. It had become something quieter, stranger, a mirror. The men still sat on the same pine benches, still listened to the same preacher speak in that low, patient rhythm. But something had shifted. They no longer knelt out of reverence. They knelt out of memory, out of grief, for their families, for the homes they might never see again, for the people they had once been and weren't sure they still were. Some stopped going altogether. The hymns were too much, the light too soft, the silence too sharp. Others went every Sunday without fail, as if the routine itself was all they had left. Lucas returned not to pray, not even to think, but to feel something that hadn't been shattered. The Bible remained where he left it, its spine now frayed from use. He didn't read it for answers anymore. He read it to remind himself that questions still mattered. One Sunday, as the men took their seats and the air inside the chapel hummed with the warmth of the season, Lucas glanced toward the back. Standing there, just inside the doorway, was the cowboy. The same one who had said, "Church starts at 10." The same one who had leaned against the fence like it was part of him. He didn't move, didn't speak, just tipped his hat, removed it, and bowed his head. It was a small moment, no grand gesture, but every man in the room felt it, one of the guards bowing with them. Not as a soldier, not as a captor, just another man in a room full of questions. And that was the thing. The chapel had stopped being about faith. It had become a space where identity could loosen, where labels, prisoner, enemy, soldier, didn't shout so loudly. Not everyone became religious. Most didn't. But almost all of them became quieter. The way a man becomes quiet when he realizes no one's watching, and he might finally ask himself who he really is. Still, guilt festered beneath the surface, especially when letters from home arrived, thin envelopes filled with stories of starvation, of children thinning out like smoke, of mothers boiling roots for supper. Back in Germany, dignity came in fragments, if at all. And here they were, sitting in chapels, sipping warm coffee, writing poetry on scraps of paper and folding it beneath their beds. One man stopped eating for 3 days. When asked why, he said simply, "My sister died last winter. I was here. She starved. No one argued. No one knew how." Lucas stopped carving for a week after his letter came. It said his old school had been bombed, all the children dead. The letter didn't say their names, but he remembered them. He read the Bible that night, but didn't understand a word. Not because of language, because of shame. How do you seek comfort when comfort feels stolen? And yet, that Sunday, he sat in the chapel again. The benches creaked beneath the weight of so many restless bodies, and behind them the cowboy stood again. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence said it all, that sometimes the only bridge between enemy and neighbor is acknowledgement, a nod, a bowed head, a hymn hummed beneath breath. Where are you watching this story from? Leave a comment down below and let us know. It means a lot to hear from you, and if this story has moved you, please like the video and push the subscribe button just below this video and click the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Every click helps us keep making stories that history almost forgot. Thank you. The war was not over, but inside that chapel, in the quiet between verses, a different kind of battle was being waged, not for territory, but for the soul. When the news came, it did not arrive with celebration. It came folded neatly in a typed notice pinned to the bulletin board by the mess hall. Repatriation commencing. Transport to Germany begins in 2 weeks. The men gathered around the paper, reading the words as if they belonged to someone else. Home. The word itself felt heavier than it should. To go home. Wasn't that what they had wanted since the first day of capture? And yet, now that it was real, no one smiled. The camp was suddenly too quiet, as if even the wind knew something was ending. The days that followed were strange. The men moved through their routines with an uneasy calm, packing what little they owned, a photograph, a book, a piece of soap, sometimes nothing at all. Lucas wrapped the German Bible in a piece of cloth and slid it into his satchel. He had not stolen it. The chaplain had pressed it into his hands during their last Sunday service. "You may need this more over there than we do here," he'd said softly, nodding toward the east. Lucas hadn't known how to answer. Others packed smaller tokens, a canteen, a carved piece of wood, a folded bulletin from the chapel. Each item felt like an anchor to a time that was both captivity and sanctuary. They had been prisoners, yes, but they had also been fed, clothed, seen. For many, the realization was unbearable that the enemy had treated them better than their own leaders ever had. The morning of departure was pale and still. Fog clung low over the camp. The trucks lined up outside the gates, engines rumbling like distant thunder. The men climbed aboard in silence, glancing back one last time at the chapel, its white paint fading into the mist. Lucas lingered at the rear, watching as a guard, the same cowboy with the hat, stood by the post, arms folded. When their eyes met, the guard tipped his hat once. Lucas nodded in return. No words, just that shared understanding suspended between them like breath in cold air. As the convoy rolled out, the camp grew smaller in the distance, the fences, the barracks, the towers, until it was nothing but a memory of straight lines against endless sky. Lucas pressed his forehead to the train window later that evening, watching the flatlands of Texas blur into gold and shadow. Behind him, someone murmured, "I never prayed in Germany, only in Texas." The others nodded, not in agreement but in recognition, because they understood. In Germany, faith had been a tool. Here, it had been a choice. The journey eastward stretched on for weeks, across ports, across oceans, across silence. The men spoke little. Each carried his own storm inside. Some dreamed of home, others dreaded it. What would they find there? Rubble? Graves? Would their families even recognize them? These men who had grown heavier with questions than hunger? When the ship finally docked, the air smelled of ash and damp earth. The sky hung gray over the ruins of Bremerhaven. Rows of buildings lay shattered, streets hollow and cold. Mothers with hollow faces searched the crowds at the port, clutching photographs that no longer matched the men who stepped off the boats. Lucas stepped onto the soil and felt both the weight and the emptiness of return. He reached into his satchel and felt the worn edges of the Bible. For the first time, he didn't open it. He simply held it, not as proof of belief, but as proof that something once unthinkable had happened. Mercy, grace, humanity from the other side. And now, back on German soil, those things felt almost unreal, like a story half-remembered. As the train to his hometown rattled eastward, Lucas looked out the window again. He saw fields scorched and villages flattened. But he also saw something small, a church steeple still standing, its cross crooked but unbroken. And for the first time since leaving Texas, he whispered a prayer he didn't expect to believe. "Let me not forget." Because the truth was unbearable, that captivity had freed something in him that victory never could. The chapel hadn't changed much. Its paint had peeled, and the wood along the window frames had faded to a soft gray, weathered by decades of sun and dust. But it still stood, stubborn, unassuming, and strangely warm. Lucas, now stooped with age and wrapped in a wool coat 2 sizes too big, walked slowly through the chapel doors. His boots echoed across the wooden floor as he took a seat on the back pew, the same one where he used to sit in silence before he had the courage to open a Bible again. A boy fidgeted beside him. Couldn't have been older than 8. He swung his legs and twisted the brim of a cowboy hat too large for his head. Lucas gave him a faint smile. The boy looked up, blinked, then turned back toward the pulpit as the music began. Not a hymn, not quite, but a gentle piano melody that felt like something remembered rather than learned. The preacher stepped up, young, clear-voiced, but measured. He didn't wear robes, just a white shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open. And when he spoke, it was without fire, no fury, just grace, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. He spoke of enemies, of fences, of how hate is easier than understanding, and how understanding is harder, but worth it. He spoke of mercy, not as a gift from above, but as something men choose every day, even when they have every reason not to. Grace, he said, is not a doctrine. It's a decision. You don't earn it. You extend it. Lucas didn't cry. Not this time. He just listened, because that was all the chapel had ever asked of him, to sit, to think, to receive without needing to defend. And now, all these years later, that space still held the same invitation, nothing forced, only offered. Outside the chapel the world had spun on. Wars had come and gone. Flags had risen and fallen. But inside, it was still 1944 in a way, still dust drifting through colored light, still wooden benches holding the weight of men who didn't know what they believed anymore, but kept showing up anyway. Faith, for Lucas, had never returned in the way it once lived. He didn't believe in miracles. He didn't whisper prayers expecting answers. But he had come to believe in something else, in people, in gestures that didn't make sense, in the man who handed him a Bible instead of a sentence, in the guard who left a knife so a question could be carved, in the cowboy who bowed his head beside the enemy he had once been trained to shoot. Those moments, small, unrecorded, had become his sermons. As the preacher spoke, Lucas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was brittle now. The ink faded. A church bulletin from Texas, dated March of 1945. He kept it like a relic, not because it proved anything, but because it reminded him that someone had once invited him to church without asking for repentance first. When the sermon ended, the boy beside him leaned over and whispered, "Did you like it?" Lucas looked at him, eyes soft, and nodded once. "Very much," he said. The boy smiled and slid the cowboy hat back on his head, crooked but proud. Lucas stayed a moment longer after the chapel emptied. He looked toward the pulpit, then down at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from memory. He didn't need to carve questions anymore. He had lived them, and somehow he had made it through. As he stood to leave, he placed the bulletin back on the bench and whispered, "Danke," not to the preacher, not to the chapel, to the version of himself who once walked in expecting chains and found something holier instead.